Let's deploy a Kafka sync for Snowflake. It supports both Snowpipe and Snowpipe streaming, and we're going to be going through an example using Snowpipe streaming. I've selected the public tenant and default namespace here in the StreamNative UI, although that doesn't matter for Kafka syncs and Kafka sources. And I've selected connectors on the left pane, and I'm going to go ahead and select Kafka syncs and say create Kafka sync. And I will be selecting the Snowflake sync connector, which again supports both Snowpipe and Snowpipe streaming. For sync details, I'm going to call the sync mySync. And for the service account, this is a non-admin service account. And the service account has a service account binding, as well as you would expect, consume and syncs permissions in public default. But in addition to that, I also have to give it produce permissions because it is going to write to a topic in public default where the Kafka Connect offsets are stored. So it has consume, produce, and syncs permissions in public default. So for the first set of configurations here, I've included the Snowflake URL name, the Snowflake username. So this is the user that I've provided the correct permissions in Snowflake based on the documentation. And for the authentication secret, I have the private key for that Snowflake account that I've created. I'm going to be publishing into a database called Snowpipe and a schema name called demo. As I'd mentioned, the offset storage topic here, I'm not changing this, but this is why I need produce permissions in the public default tenant and namespace. And then the topic I'm going to produce to for this test is Kafka 10. Let me go ahead and open up the advanced settings. I have found for Snowpipe streaming, the connector does require the role name. So here I've included SN as my role that I created inside of Snowflake. Scrolling down for the Snowflake ingestion method, I've changed it from Snowpipe to Snowpipe_streaming. Then I've additionally made some changes to the converter classes. For the key converter class, I'm using a string converter. For the value converter class, I'm using the Avro converter. And this particular Avro converter requires 3 additional fields in the value.converter, and that is schema.registry URL, the basic auth credential source, and the basic auth user info. For schema.registry URL, you can open a new browser window and navigate to your cluster dashboard. Here it's train instance train cluster. Going to the overview tab and scrolling down, you can get the Kafka schema registry URL here, which starts with the HTTPS at the beginning and ends with the /Kafka. For the basic auth credentials source, I'm going to be using a API key, so the value is just user info. And then the basic auth user info will be a string. Here I'm just using public, that's the easiest one to use, colon, followed by your API key. If I go ahead and click submit, let me just double check. I don't think there's anything else I want to adjust here. So go ahead and click submit to submit the Kafka Connect connector for Snowflake. And in this case, we've configured it to use Snowpipe streaming. It will start out by saying unassigned, and after just a few minutes, we should see that it's ready. If everything is working as expected, we can now see that it has a status of running. We're now ready to start testing this connector. Back on the cluster dashboard, if I go to the overview page again, I'm going to want to copy out the Kafka service URL, that's where we'll be publishing messages to, as well as the schema registry URL again. Here in IntelliJ, I have a topic called Kafka 10 that I'm publishing to, and that will go into the public tenant default namespace. Here is that server for the Kafka endpoint that I had copied out of the UI just now, as well as the schema registry URL down here. I'm going to go ahead and produce 10 messages here using my Avro producer Java code. And it's going to produce with a few fields. There's going to be an item field and a cost field. So let me go ahead and run that code. And here we've produced 10 Kafka messages to that topic. And here in Snowflake, I've gone into my Snowpipe database, my demo schema, and when I refresh, I see that Kafka 10 table is now available. If I do a select star from that using my database and schema, I'll be able to see here that the 10 messages have now been moved over into Snowflake.